Out in the high country of Arizona, where the juniper leans into the wind and the dust keeps its own calendar, there lived a man who had quietly stepped out of the parade of life. His name was James Coulter. If you've ever watched a house settle into itself after everybody's left, you know the feeling of his days. Slow coffee, a potbelly stove that remembered better winters, a shotgun kept clean more out of ritual than need. 12 years alone had taught him the music of creaking floorboards and the mercy of silence. It had also taught him to stop expecting anything new. James carried the past the way some men wear a limp. Every step a reminder. Tennessee. A war that didn't end when the papers said it did. One face he hadn't saved. He didn't talk about it because saying certain things out loud can make them permanent. So he lived with his cabin, his tools, his memories, and the stubborn notion that the horizon had decided it was none of his business. Then one afternoon, the horizon proved him wrong. She came out of the trees like the wind had given up on carrying her. Barefoot, filthy, wrapped in what might once have been a white dress, now a rag that could barely remember its purpose. She didn't scream or plead, she folded. 2 words scraped out of her throat. Please don't. James didn't ask who or what. He did what a man does when the world drops something broken on his porch. He took off his coat and made a shelter out of it. When the cloth slipped, he saw her back. I won't linger on it, but I'll tell you this. There are scars that look like handwriting, and hers told a history no one had the right to write. Burns, lines, marks in the shape of a man's arrogance. It wasn't the sight of wounds that made James step back. He'd seen plenty of those. It was the way she curled into herself with practiced skill, like a woman who had learned disappearing as a second language. Maybe you've stood beside someone who's learned that language. You move slowly, you let the room breathe, you trade questions for simple acts. James gathered her up, bone light but heavy with everything she'd carried, and brought her inside. He fed the stove, not for heat, but for the sound. Crackle, hum, heartbeat. He made coffee far too bitter and kept his hands in plain sight. For a long time he sat and watched the flame and listened for any sign that the quiet was doing its work. Her first word came like a tiny flag staked in hard ground. Water. He knelt and held the cup in both hands as if reverence might keep it from spilling. She drank the way people do when they are relearning trust. Small sips, eyes on his face, the kind of gaze that says, I'm not thanking you yet, but I'm not leaving either. He nodded once. Sometimes a nod is the cleanest promise. As the day turned itself into evening, her name made a cautious appearance. Ellie. It arrived in the room without making a scene, the way a scared bird might slip under a porch to see if the cat is watching. She didn't offer more. James didn't press. Silence can be a scaffold if you use it right.
The next morning, the land woke up the way it does out there. Light climbing over the ridgeline, the smell of dust warming in the sun. Ellie sat up on the cot and held the coat like it was stitched out of safety. Every sound made her flinch, the wind at the shutters, a branch breaking itself against gravity. If you've ever been on edge long enough, you know how even good noises can come in wearing bad clothes. James made eggs that went rubbery and coffee that could strip paint and set both within reach, not as an order, but as an invitation. She didn't say much. He didn't either. But sometime later, on the porch where the floorboards knew his weight by heart, she said a few facts like someone emptying a pocket full of nails, carefully, not because they're heavy, but because they're sharp. There was a mining camp, she said, not official, not on any map you'd hang in a courthouse. A place that mined ore and dignity by the same method. Break it out of the rock and call the cost a detail. The first time she ran, they broke her nose. The second time, they carved their rules onto her back. She didn't say how she made it out the third time. He didn't ask. Some answers belong to a stronger day. It may sound like Old West mythology, but if you look into our history, you'll find company towns and camps where wages were scrip and rules were pain. We like to imagine cruelty is vintage, sepia-toned, and outgrown. Truth is, it moves zip codes. It changes its haircut. It still thinks a fence line is a moral shield. Out there, in those hard hills, men with soft hands and hard money believe distance will do their dirty talking. That afternoon, distance brought a visitor. James heard the horse first, hooves making their case up the ridge road. He stood, and the shotgun found its way to his hands, not like a threat, more like an old tool answering its name. Ellie froze, then slid inside like a shadow taking its cue. The man who rode up had the look of someone who paid other people to sweat. Fancy vest, mustache trimmed into a performance. When men like that look at you, it's less a gaze and more evaluation. He didn't introduce himself to James. He introduced himself to the land by acting like he owned it. "Ellie Rose," he called out, voice sugared like bad lemonade. "You got one chance to come back quiet." James stepped off the porch and into the little space where a man decides what kind of man he is. "She's not going anywhere." The rider's lip tilted. "Not up to you, old-timer." There are sentences that don't deserve to be finished. James didn't raise the shotgun so much as he let it speak the language cowards understand. Certainty. The man spat in the dirt, turned his horse like a theater curtain, and left. But he left the way thunder leaves when it's planning a return.
That night, James wrote a note to an old friend, the kind of letter that smells like linseed oil and worry. Abram Hale. Tennessee days had put them shoulder to shoulder, one man covering the other so often they began to trust their lives to borrowed instincts. Now Abram wore a badge that meant something. In those parts, that mattered less than it should have, and more than nothing at all. The next 3 days felt like a held breath. If you've sat through those kinds of hours, you know the ritual. Clean the gun too long, stack wood twice, count the steps from door to tree line because numbers make a person feel in control. Ellie watched the windows. James watched the road. It was not romance, it was attention, which is maybe the more reliable sibling. Late on the third afternoon, the birds went silent the way they do when they decide you're not worth warning anymore. Dust rose off the ridge road in a ribbon. 3 riders, not ranch hands, not law. Men who sit easy in the saddle because they've never been bucked by their own conscience. "Step aside, old man," the lead one said, and the casualness in his tone told you how many times he'd gotten what he wanted. James didn't. The second rider's hand drifted toward his belt, a slow arrogance that counted on hesitation. James didn't give him the math. One blast clawed the air and dumped the man out of his saddle with a scream that checked the courage of the others. The world gets very crisp in those moments. Angles, distances, how loud your own breath is. Then a new voice cut the heat. Calm. Worn in. "I'd think real hard about your next move." From the trees, a figure stepped out with the kind of posture that says the badge on his chest was earned, not gifted. Abram Hale, rifle low, eyes unflinching. He didn't pose, he didn't shout. He let the weight of lawful certainty stand where the dust was still negotiating. "This is my jurisdiction," he said. He glanced toward the cabin, toward Ellie without pointing. Respect is a direction, not a finger. "She's under my protection." Now, money believes the law is a costume. It doesn't know what to do with a man who wears it like skin. The riders backed up their horses, gathered their wounded, and left with the promise of return diluted by the taste of risk. It wasn't a victory lap moment. It was a reprieve, and sometimes reprieve is the most generous part of rescue. You would think the cabin might tremble like a dog after a storm. Instead, it learned a steadier quiet. Ellie still startled at knocks the world didn't mean to make, the stove's sharp pop, a door hinge remembering it was old. The body is not a courtroom. It doesn't declare you safe because the facts say so. But mornings returned. She sat at the table with both hands around a mug like it was the first warm thing to hold her. She asked James how the stove worked, how often to re-tar a roof, what you plant where the sun arrives late. He answered without teaching, and that's harder than it sounds. She brought in wildflowers one day, scrappy little bursts of color you wouldn't notice if they weren't brave. Set them in an old jar on the sill like a promise she wasn't ready to put into words. James looked at the jar a long time, and then, the next morning, swept the porch. If you've lived with grief, you know those trades. You bring beauty, I'll bring order. You open the window, I'll fix the screen. That's how homes are repaired, one small, unremarkable vow at a time. They didn't name what grew between them. They let it be a room with comfortable chairs and good light. Evenings they ate stew that tasted like effort and coffee black enough to anchor a ship. One of those nights, Ellie asked a question that didn't require an answer so much as a place to set it down. "You ever think some people aren't here to save others?" she said, voice soft but certain, "but to give them the space to save themselves?" James felt words rise, then fall back. He didn't trust them not to get in the way, so he nodded. In my experience, that's one of the bravest things we do. Choose not to be the hero when we want the credit, and instead be the harbor when somebody needs the weather to change. Maybe you've been on one side of that equation, maybe both. I remember a friend of mine years ago sitting at his kitchen table after the wheels came off his life. I wanted to fix him like he was a chair, glue, clamps, done by sundown. But people aren't furniture. We drank bad coffee for a month of Tuesdays and didn't solve a single thing. Still, one night he looked at me and said, "Thanks for not making me perform getting better." That's what James did for Ellie. That's what Ellie, in her own way, did for James. Meanwhile, Abram did what good lawmen do. He kept showing up. Not loud, not hungry for a scene. He took statements. He walked the ridge road, eyes on the ground and on the horizon. He put names to faces and faces to deeds, and began the slow work the West rarely applauds, building a case that didn't rely on myth. There were men in town who didn't like the direction the wind had turned, and men out by the camp who liked it even less. But a badge backed by patience can be a prairie fire when it finally finds its spark. There were setbacks you won't see in dime novels. Nights Ellie woke from dreams so vivid they left fingerprints. Days when she wouldn't cross the threshold until she'd counted to a number only she knew. James learned the art of tending a fire without making noise. He talked to the stove like it needed encouragement. He respected the skittishness the way you respect a colt. Calm hands, clear space, no sudden moves. Healing didn't turn her scars into poetry. It gave them new job descriptions. That matters. The worst thing that happened to you doesn't vanish because good entered the room. It just stops being your whole name. On a day when the sky put a purple sheen on the hills, Ellie stood at the window long enough to claim the view. She said, "I used to think the world ended at a fence. Funny how much farther it goes when nobody's holding the gate." James poured coffee. "Gates are meant to swing," he said, and the simplicity felt like a blessing. I won't pretend the story ended there with a ribbon and a sunset. Men who build empires from other people's fear rarely fold after one bad afternoon. There were papers to be written, warrants to be signed, and a sheriff who had to decide how loudly to say names that bought themselves quiet. There were nights James slept with the shotgun across his knees, and mornings Ellie checked the road twice. Safety doesn't arrive with a marching band. It tiptoes. It asks for proof. Eventually, it unpacks a suitcase. And here's where I want to turn to you, the way I would if we were sitting at a kitchen table with mugs that have seen better days. Who are you in this kind of story? Are you the one who has learned to disappear so well that even the mirror sometimes forgets you? Are you the one who has made peace with loneliness because it demands less explaining? Are you the friend with a badge,
Not literal, maybe, but the kind that says, "I'll stand here with you until what's right grows a spine." We live in a big country, big enough to hide a lot of wrong, big enough that camps can exist on the edge of maps and consciences. We also live in small houses with thin walls, where a single act of steadiness can change the climate of a life. Both are true at the same time. I think that's what this story reminds me. Justice is often slow, but mercy can be immediate. You can't always arrest a problem by sundown, but you can open a door and stand in it. So James kept sweeping. Ellie kept bringing in the wildflowers that had the nerve to bloom where nobody promised they would. He showed her where the pines hold their shade even on mean days. She showed him how to set 2 cups out even when you're only sure about 1. They found a rhythm that didn't need announcing. He learned that quiet could be generous instead of empty. She learned that rooms could be safe without locks. One evening, Abram leaned on the porch rail, the sort of posture that tells you a man's guard is still up, even when his shoulders have given him the night off. The valley was the color of old copper. "We're not done," he said. "I know," James answered. "Doesn't mean you can't rest." "I'm learning," James said. And they let the light go slow without hurrying it along. Ellie stepped outside, with a book tucked against her ribs, a small thing that felt like a declaration. "I have time now." "Coffee?" she asked, careful but not afraid. "Always," Abram said. James nodded. The 3 of them stood there for a moment in a silence that for once didn't need translating.
If you came here for a shootout, I can't offer that today. Not because violence doesn't visit, but because this isn't a story about thunder. It's a story about roofs that hold, brooms that move dust without complaint, mugs that warm hands even before they touch lips. It's about how love, call it care if the other word makes you shy, chooses verbs over speeches. And before we close, I want to say this plain. There are still Ellies out there, people whose lives have been marked by someone else's signature. There are still Jameses sitting in quiet rooms, convinced the best thing they can do for the world is to stay out of its way. The truth this story hands us, with gentle insistence, is that rescue and being rescued sometimes look like the same posture. A person standing steady in a doorway, refusing to move. So tell me, quietly, to yourself, who are you right now? Who could use the space you're able to make? If this story finds you on a day you needed a reason to keep going, or a reason to knock on someone else's door, let it sit with you. Let it change the air. And if you know a place in your town, on your street, in your family, where the map doesn't show everything that's happening, remember Abram's patience. Remember that a badge isn't just metal, it's a commitment to return. Back in that cabin on the hill that tilts its chin at the sky, a man who thought he was finished learned the first lines of a new beginning. A woman who thought she was a prisoner learned the feel of a porch under bare feet and the sound of coffee poured for her because she asked for it. And a friend who wears the law remembered, yet again, why he pinned it over his heart in the first place. The wind out there still speaks in an old dialect. If you listen close, it doesn't sound like warning anymore. It sounds like a promise. Stories like this don't end. They continue, hand to hand, porch to porch. Every time one of us chooses to stay, to make room, to keep the fire humming, so someone else can find their way back to themselves.